Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY. In this episode I make a bowl from ash segmented rings and 3 colour epoxy resin. I use this project to try out some new ideas I have for an upcoming video, but more of that later. For now, let's get started. For this project I made 3 segmented rings. Each contains 18 segments that were cut on the table saw. The mitre jig is set to 10 degrees. 2 rings needed to be around 190mm to fit into the casting bucket. The third would be for the rim and would be slightly bigger at around 230mm. With 54 segments cut, each one then needed to be sanded to remove the scraggy bits left by the saw, and off camera I did a dry fit to make sure each ring had nice tight joints. That done, I moved on to the glue up. My glue of choice is Type Bond 2. This was applied liberally to 6 segments at a time, and once the ring was assembled, I used a hose clamp to squeeze the joints and hold it together. The reason for using so much glue is firstly because I'm gluing end grain. The other reason is that any open joints will be filled by resin in the casting process, which doesn't look great. I even go as far as rubbing glue into any joints that look to have gaps. With the hose clamp nice and tight, I then assembled the 2 remaining rings, making sure they were as flat as possible. The rings were then left for 24 hours for the glue to cure. It's the next day and the rings are ready to be sanded. To remove the dried glue and flatten them. For this I use my drum sander. Each ring is passed through multiple times until all the low spots have gone and I'm left with a nice clean surface. If it wasn't for this machine, I don't think I would attempt segmented wood turning. Leveling the rings by hand would be a laborious task, especially on the bigger projects with lots of rings. I've had this one for about 2 years and it hasn't missed a beat. I regularly clean the abrasive loading with a cleaning stick and I always use dust extraction. Without it, the dust would get everywhere. After sanding the rings, I made a circular block. This will fit into the hole in the centre of the base rings. I glued 2 pieces of ash together, then turned it to round on the lathe. I wanted it to be a slack fit, so I could get the resin to flow around it to make a nice feature. Doing this would also save on the total amount of resin, and is one of the things I wanted to try out for future projects. Centre block done, off camera I superglued the 2 base rings together and turned it down on the lathe to fit in the casting bucket. I also cleaned up the centre hole and sanded any frayed edges. To hold the centre block in position I used cut down mixing sticks and superglue. First I did the underside, adding smaller bits around the edges so it would sit level in the bucket. After waxing the bucket, the blank was placed inside and more sticks were added to the top to hold the block in the centre. I also added 3 raised bits of sticks to lift the MDF waste block clear of the base section so that the resin would flow underneath it and fill the base rings, and once said MDF waste block was glued in position, it was ready for casting. At this point, the chosen colours were going to be red, sapphire blue and olive green, and I hoped 3 batches would be enough. so I set about mixing my favoured brand of epoxy resin, but with both parts added at a 2:1 ratio, I had a sudden change of heart and replaced the red mica powder with antique gold. The three seemed to go together much better. With the colourant added, I mixed each batch thoroughly. Nowadays I mix each for about 2 minutes without any problems. This will of course depend on the type and brand, so I would always recommend you use the manufacturer's recommendations. After mixing, I left the resin to pre-cure before adding it to the casting bucket. This is to get a better colour separation. I begin by taking an ambient temp, then I keep checking until the resin achieves a prescribed temperature, then I begin the pour. I learned to do this through trial and error, and I'm not recommending this as how it should be done, it's just how I do it. The resin was beginning to gel, so I had to move quickly to get it into the pressure pot. Now can anyone spot the mistake I'm making? As soon as the casting was in the pressure pot, I screwed the lid down nice and tight and began to add pressure. But just in time, I realised what I'd forgotten, so I had to release the pressure, remove the lid and add the missing weight to the top of the blank. Good job I remembered. The ash blank had already begun to float and tilt to one side, and it took a bit of force to get it seated correctly. Anyway, disaster averted, I screwed the lid on once more and added 50 to 55 psi. It's the next day and time to remove the casting. I just hoped it was okay. On first impressions it looked good. The waste block was still centred and the colour separation looked perfect. And once it was out the casting bucket, the good news continued. No cracks or visible voids. It was a big relief. Eager to move on, I chiselled away the excess waste block, marked the centre and drilled a hole for the woodworm screw and the tailstock centre. That done, I fixed the blank to the lathe. Using MDF for the waste block has its problems. One being it isn't very good at holding onto the woodworm screw, so I only lightly tighten it down and use the tailstock to add the required pressure to hold it firmly in place. The blank was reasonably well balanced, so after turning the speed up to around 1000 RPM, I began removing material to get it to round, but the main thing I had to do was cut a mortise in the base so I could turn the blank around and level the top. Learning from my last project, I also had to check to make sure the segmented rings were aligned and perpendicular to the centre line, and after removing the resin to expose the joint, all was well, no wonky segmental rings. So after a bit more work to get the blank suitably balanced and to round, I could move on to cutting the mortise. To cut the mortise, first I levelled the base. For this I used the bowl gouge to cut through the thin layer of resin, and then I used the skew chisel to remove the tool marks and refine the surface. To cut the mortise, I used the 1/4" parting tool to define the outer edge, cutting to a depth of around 6mm, clearing most of the inner material away at the same time. Then I cut the dovetail with a dovetail cutter, and then I finished off with a bowl gouge before using the skew to add some decorative rings. Then I sanded just the base from 80 to 600 grit, and whilst I could get to it, I then applied a finish just to the underside, finished off with Hampshire Sheen gloss finishing wax. To level the top, I used a combination of the full-size carbide cutter and the bowl gouge, finishing off with a skew chisel. I only needed to level the first couple of inches, just enough to clear the segmented rim. Next, the segmented rim needed to be sanded, just on one side to expose a nice clean surface. I remade this ring as the first one wasn't big enough. To fix the rim to the resin blank, I used fast cure epoxy with gold mica powder added to help to hide the join. Once the epoxy was mixed, it was applied as evenly as possible around the top of the blank, then the two pieces were stuck together, using the weight of the heavy blank to squeeze the joint. I did my best to align the rim joints with the joints in the base ring, but I was a little bit off. After 30 minutes or so, I refixed the blank to the lathe and got on with shaping the outside surface. I started with the rim. Using the bowl gouge, I turned it down to round. I was going to cut and roughly shape the undercut, but I wanted to try something a bit different. So whilst I had to think about it, I moved on to the cutout to form the pedestal. I formed the cutout in the usual way, using the 3/8 bowl gouge alternating the cut between the lower and the upper rings, gradually cutting deeper with each pass, being careful not to get a catch on the open side of the blade. You can see in this close-up how I shear scrape the surface, shaping the upper part into the side of the bowl, and in the process adding a lovely deep gash into the resin. Definitely the catch of the day. To fix the catch, I used the full-size carbide to remove material until any trace of it had disappeared. That done, I continued shaping the cutout. I did think about exposing the resin around the inner core, but because it was so thin, I decided against it, settling instead for a clean, sharp transition between the upper and lower cut lines. I reduced the base diameter, but not too much. I wanted the base to be fairly wide. This then allowed me to take some more out of the cutout, both on the lower and the upper cuts. I felt it would look better with more material removed, making it appear less bulky. With the cutout more or less to shape, I switched over to the skew chisel to blend and fare the mid-resin section into the upper part of the cutout. I just sharpened the skew and it gave a really clean cut on the resin, which gave a glimpse of the colours, which looked really nice. The transition in the cutout needed to be sharpened up. To do this, I used the 1/2-inch spindle gouge to take a very fine cut. Then I used the bowl gouge to shear scrape the surface, and that was the cutout done. So on to the rim. I wanted to try a new design, which would require an undercut. but the rim just wasn't wide enough, so I abandoned that idea and tried something else. Using the bowl gouge, I started to form an OG shape, curving round and up from the resin into a flatter vertical top part. The skew was good for shaping the upper external curves down into the lower part, but I switched to the mid-sized carbide to cut the sharper internal curves. And finally, to blend it all together, I used a small negative rate scraper and the skew chisel. A quick check revealed a slightly wonky join between the resin and the segmented ring, but it wasn't that bad. So I sanded with 80 grit to check for any tool marks, then I began hollowing out. To begin hollowing out, first I had to remove material from the rim to make the opening wider, roughly shaping it at the same time. For this I used the bowl gouge. Using a series of push cuts and shear scraping, I gradually formed a curving shape, roughly following the external profile of the rim, checking the thickness as I went. The tailstock was restricting access, so I switched to the parting tool to remove the excess material and define the inner edge of the rim. That done, I went back to the gouge, shear scraping the ash to get closer to the finished surface. I refined the shape with a small negative rate scraper, then I moved on to cutting out the MDF waste block. To do this, I used both the side cutting scraper and the bowl gouge. Unlike the previous bowl, the MDF in this one hadn't soaked up a lot of the resin, which made the gouge much more effective at hogging out the waste. I spoke earlier on in the video about trying new things. Well, this was another one. I used a much bigger waste block to save resin. Up to now, I've always been afraid of not having enough thickness in the resin sidewall to get the profile I wanted. So I'm going to take this a step further and begin to make the waste blocks much closer to the internal shape of the projects I'll be working on. After removing what was left of the waste resin and mixing sticks in the base of the bowl, I cut away the centre support. Most of it just broke off. The rest was dealt with using the bowl gouge on the MDF, then the carbide cutter to remove what was left, revealing the ash and resin core. To make it easier to do the final shaping, I turned the headstock of the lathe to 45 degrees. This gave me much better access with a small negative rate scraper to blend and fare the surface of the resin up into the segmented rim. Happy the rim and side was finished, and with the headstock back in its home position, I just had the base to flatten. Using nearly every scraper I had, I gradually refined the surface, finally blending the side into the base, and then it was done. Then I sanded both inside and out from 80 to 600 grit, continuing up to 3000 grit on the resin. Then I cleaned down with denatured alcohol, followed by a liberal application of sanding sealer, which I denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. And next up, Yorkshire grit. Just a single application, thoroughly cleaned away until no more residue is picking up on the paper towel. Then the resin polishing, beginning with Polishin 10, a single coat, also thoroughly cleaned away with more paper towel, ready for the next stage. Polishin 5, another single coat, thoroughly polished off to leave a deep shine. And to finish, Hampshire Sheen Gloss Finishing Wax, 2 coats, buffed to seal and protect the surface. And that's it, another project finished, and this has been a good one. The new things I tried all seem to work out, and the finished piece looks great, and I hope you like it as well. Once again, the colour separation worked, and the 3 colours contrasting against the ash segmented rings really makes this stand out. Anyway, with that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, a thumbs up will be much appreciated, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.